As your application codebase grows, how you manage the authorization logic sprinkled across that codebase can get more and more challenging. And this is where an approach called externalized authorization management can really come in and help and bring some sanity across your application codebase. But first, when do you get to the point where you think you might need to consider an externalized authorization management approach? Really comes down to a few different scenarios. Firstly, if you have lots of different services and the authorization logic is having to be replicated across all those different services, potentially in different languages, that's a sign things may need a bit of a tweak. If you end up with these very complex conditional statements, if, else, case, switch style logic across your application code to determine whether access should be allowed or not, that's another sign things might need to be looked at again. Whenever you have to make a policy change or an authorization logic change, you have to go and touch and update various bits of your code base and roll out a new deployment. That's a sign that externalized approach may be better. If you end up getting to a world where it's difficult to maintain consistency across the logic, across those different services, across those different authorization checks, that's another sign that an externalized approach might be a bit better. And finally, if you're struggling to get visibility and insight into how those decisions are made, who did what, where inside of your system, then externalized authorization management can bring you some benefits around audit logs and getting insights into exactly what happened inside of your application. Externalized authorization management really is a fundamental change in how you think about authorization, and it really becomes a separate architectural concern inside of your system. Instead of having the logic hard-coded in your application, you now start writing your authorization logic as a policy and then deploy policy decision points as another service inside of your stack. So it's another block inside of your architecture. Then every part of your application code that needs to go and check whether a user can do an action or not, either at the code level, maybe at the gateway level, even at the authentication time level, you can then ask this central service, a policy decision point, hey, got this user, can they do this action on this particular resource? There's now a single point where that logic is defined, that single point where all the decisions are made, regardless of what language or framework your services are using to get to that authorization decision. Plus, there's a single point where those audit logs are captured. So the technical benefits of this really come down to this externalized approach means you can have sort of an enhanced policy management. There's now that single source of truth. You can actually have policy and have tests written against those policy and have a whole CI/CD pipeline dedicated just to your authorization checks to ensure all your business cases are covered. Make sure every change goes through the same pipeline. Make sure you really are catching every single edge case. And also when it comes to deployment and rollbacks, you can actually push out policy updates, and now your application is behaving based on your new authorization logic without having to redeploy the application code. And rollbacks work the same way. You can just revert back a commit or a change to your policies, and now your application is updated inherently without you having to redeploy the app. This externalized, consistent, centralized policy enforcement approach means that you have a single consistent place where those decisions are made and is independent of the application logic. You know, your business logic inside the app works as before, but now that final check to make sure whether the specific user can do a specific action or specific resource in a request is now given out to a policy decision point and enforces that how decisions are made. You get the scalability without having to do redundant policy definitions. So every time you were implementing an if-else case switch style logic in your application code and then having to re-implement or duplicate that code into, say, another service, there's going to be chances of hiccups, there's going to be chances of mistakes, there's going to be a chance of repeating yourself and then things falling through the crack. So you get the scalability by defining your policy once and then having lots of policy decision points running, then each of your services can call into that and get a decision. Ultimately, it also reduces your development overhead. You do this logic once. You can even have a product team or a security team or identity team focusing just on the authorization policy piece of the application, and your actual development team can be focusing on actually building the application and the services and the scale that it needs to work behind the scenes. Another great advantage of taking this externalized approach is you can actually get much more fine-grained observability. Every policy decision point that makes a decision can log a standard audit log. At this time, this user tried to do this action on this resource, and it was either allowed or denied by this particular policy consistently. So you don't have to worry about implementing audit logs in each application service. It's all being handled by that central authorization layer that's being run and driven by your policies, which is really super important when it comes to things like compliance. And if you're working in regulated industries, an externalized authorization management approach, it gives you that single audit trail and decision logic of exactly what happened inside of the application. And finally, there really is a chance to now bring in some real-world context or integration. If you were just doing the checks inside of the application layer, there may be context about the request that is not available. So if you wanted to go and look at what services the request chain came through, or you want to go and reference context outside of their application scope, application's domain to make an authorization decision, you don't have to implement that logic inside of the application itself. It can be encompassed and held inside of the policy decision point. So you can decide authorization checks based on other environmental context, upstream context, or even a downstream service to go and fetch and use attributes to make an authorization decision. Things like risk scores from a risk score management system, or taking context from your IDP, which may not be available inside of every single microservice. This can all become part as an input in the decision-making criteria for your application. In terms of going about implementing externalized authorization management, it involves really getting your business on the same page around what your authorization logic is. We always say when we talk to customers and prospects that 90% of the effort to implement a policy-based authorization approach is actually getting the business agreed on what the authorization logic needs to be. Converting that to policy is really the last 10% and wiring in your application. But getting them on the same page and agreeing on what your authorization logic needs to be is definitely number one. And then making sure you select a authorization solution that fits your architecture and fits your data model and fits your compliance model as well. And make sure that will then scale and grow with you as your business requirements evolve. If you're looking for a solution for this, Cerbos and Cerbos Hub is one obviously we make available, but I'm looking forward to chatting more about your requirement and how externalized authorization management can help you. Thanks.